I think now we'd like to have sort of a discussion in light of this. Maybe just to clarify a restatement of the problem. So in this prospective study, could you just tell us a little bit more, how was monitoring instituted to begin with? So how much, you talked about flexibility being essential yet difficult, but how did safety monitoring, how was it instituted in this particular study?
Sure. It's interesting. If this were a new agent, we would be very, very interested in its adverse effect profile. Lithium, Dr. Simon's on our Data and Safety Management Board. This study isn't going to tell us anything new about the adverse effects and their frequency for lithium, as Greg pointed out. Nevertheless, we're very carefully monitoring using good clinical practice. Some issues are important, even veterans. There was a pregnancy in this study. And dealing with that was a significant difficulty. But most of the side effects were the bread and butter routine side effects that were one of the major concerns in designing this study was what about the potential for study medication overdose? I mentioned two other larger scale clinical trials that have been done over recent years. In them, about 2% of patients overdosed on study medications. This didn't happen, at least not yet in our study, yet we administer medications in blister packs and unlimited size to try to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, but before you talk about that specific question about the safety monitoring, I just want to say I love this study. So full disclosure, I love this study. I think it's an incredibly important and ambitious thing to do. I hope it succeeds, but it's incredibly challenging, and I think really highlights exactly the questions that we want to highlight when we talk about real-world patients, real-world treatment, real-world practice, and the challenges there. As Ira said, I think to me, one of the reasons this is a really nice use case to talk about is that we are expecting there will be a coming new generation of medication treatments that may actually have strong anti-suicide activities. I would put forward that our current way of evaluating treatments in mental health will be completely incapable of assessing that question. The way we do research now simply cannot assess that question. We're going to need to figure out how to do something like Ira is doing if we're going to assess that question accurately. So I'm hoping we can learn from that. Even though this is, you could say, this is a 20-year-old question, there are some questions that we will be asking maybe 1 or 2 years from now where we're going to need to use this. The question about safety monitoring, Honor, really underlines something that Ira said about why you do safety monitoring in a trial like this, especially a trial of a known treatment. And as Ira may remember, I was on the data monitoring committee, and actually, I think was really irritating to some of the people running the committee, because I can be irritating, kept getting, sort of, to me, there was a lot of confusion about when we do safety monitoring. Sometimes our goal is inference. For new treatment, we are sometimes trying to make valid inference and generalizable inference about the adverse effects profile of a new treatment, and that is unknown. And an inference task is very different from the task of what I would say this trial safety monitoring is about is the study team doing the right thing by a person who seems to be in trouble? That second task is not an inference task. It is a conflict of interest problem. Investigators have dual interests. Investigators have an interest to the protocol and making sure people remain in protocol, and they have an interest to the participant. And we want to make sure the interest, the duty to the participant always trumps the duty to the protocol. And, as Ira may remember, on the data monitoring committee, they wanted to give us really elaborate reports about adverse events in patients in getting treatment A and treatment B. And I said, you really don't need to tell me about the rates of tremor in people getting these two treatments. I think we know that lithium causes tremor. And if you were to show me with a p-value of 0.0001 that placebo has a higher tremor rate than lithium, I would say that is a false finding. Because I have 70 years of priors with a sample size thousands of times as big that tells me otherwise. So there could really be no valid inference about the adverse effects of lithium that could emerge from this trial. And I kept sort of tearing what little hair I have left out and saying, we need to stop looking at that question. That's not the question. The question here is about, are we doing the right thing by people? But I think when we talk about doing studies in real world settings, we have to get clear when we're talking about safety monitoring, what is our question? To what degree is this an inference question? To what degree is this a conflict of interest question? Sometimes the procedures we set up to address those two things are different, so we just need to be clear what's the thing we're trying to do and we're doing that the right way. To me, though, in this trial, there are some important generalizable lessons about this question of safety monitoring in the real world and how you do that. The other thing that's really important about this is as Ira said, if we're going to study this problem, we are going to need to include people in trials who do not behave as we would always hope. And to be blunt, by definition, attempting to end one's life is a type of behavior we would hope would never occur, but it does. And if we were to only enroll people who would have zero risk for that behavior, the null result is, of course, guaranteed. What that means is, as Ira said, people doing things like having unprotected sex and getting pregnant, even though we told them not to. That's not a protocol violation. That's human behavior. That's how people live. So we need to sort of move away from that idea that when people behave as humans behave, this is how something bad that the study has done that people need to be chastised for, or their site suspended, or something like that. This is how the world works. And if we're trying to get results that generalize to the world, we have to live with all of that, as sometimes scary and confusing as it can be. So really long-winded tirade about safety monitoring, but I think my point is that this idea of real-world safety monitoring has some really fundamental conceptual differences from the way we've traditionally thought about that, and we need to get wrap our minds around those clearer ideas.
Greg, can I follow up on that for 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
There is a way that, in many respects, that can be exploited. For example, the major studies on HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis that was using a well-established treatment in HIV to see if it could prevent HIV. Patients were consistently, and these were serodiscordant couples. One was HIV positive, one was HIV negative. The subjects were consistently advised safer sex, practice safer sex, or use a condom, and yet there were 121 plus pregnancies in that trial, and that's actually without transmission of HIV. That was one of the endpoints then that they were looking at to show that in fact this was effective therapy. So in fact, some of these safety monitorings can, in fact, really help you in the study in a real-world setting.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I think that, Michael and I have talked about this, the interesting parallels between these sort of, pre-exposure prophylaxis for prevention of HIV transmission, suicide prevention, studying things that involve sometimes undesirable and stigmatized behaviors where unless we welcome in the way the real world works, we're never going to answer the question.
Yeah, so let me maybe summarize. So here we have a medical product that has been widely used for quite a very long time, but maybe it has never been formally studied in a trial for this particular indication. Does the product even have a label for this particular?
No.
Okay, but there's been a lot of real-world use of it over time, and then observational studies were equivocal. So there was a decision to conduct a pragmatic trial. So is it really ultimately about the stage of the medical product, the stage in its life cycle, its it's how much use does it have in the real world that actually helps us inform about the level of safety, whether routine safety is appropriate for this type of interventional study, or whether there is additional measures that has to be instituted to ensure patient safety. Is this a fair formulation of the statement?
I completely expect that, as I say, we will see a new generation of drugs which will likely be approved initially for treatment of treatment-resistant depression, where, to be honest with you, the greatest interest in the practitioner and the patient community will be their anti-suicide effects. I'm quite certain that when those drugs are approved, they will not be approved as treatments for suicidality, because that is would be a nearly impossible indication to get approval for. But that's what everybody's going to care about. So I think we are about to see a similar repeat of this lithium story. My fondest hope is that it will not take us 60 years to answer the question next time. Because this is a 60-year-old question, and we still don't know the answer.
Okay, very good. Before we move the second presentation about anticoagulants, I'd like to open it up to the wider audience for any comments. Do we see any generalizable lessons about other therapeutic areas or other medical products and so on? So we'd welcome your questions and your thoughts from the audience. Yeah. Go ahead.
I've always got questions and comments, whether it's worth anything or not, I don't know. But I mean, it seems like one very generalizable thing is that collecting non-serious adverse events after you've reached a certain point is a complete waste of time and money. And the FDA has, officially said, please don't do this. But because some European regulatory agencies demand it, the industry-funded global the global companies are stuck where they have to sink to the lowest common denominator. But I mean, it seems to me that this is a place where we could really just follow through on, getting international cooperation. It would make a big difference. I think the point about planning for what it is you're trying to learn is another good one, but, for all the reasons that you gave. And there are many other diseases where if you're looking for adverse events, for example, in many diseases, it's the people that are on multiple drugs where you're most likely to see catastrophic things, and yet in traditional regulated trials, these people are excluded. And then finally, I'd say it even relates to the places where you do the research. And as long as the mantra of GCP is what's followed the way it's currently written, you would exclude entire health systems that, for example, might have high proportions of immigrants who are not citizens, because the follow-up rates are going to be lower. In fact, at one point in my career, we actually tried to include those people because we wanted minority enrollment, and the site was barred by the FDA from participating in clinical trials, and the investigator, who was a prominent person, actually got blacklisted on the website. So the real consequences of overdoing this thing related to the kind of safety outcomes that you want to look at.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up a little on that question about adverse event monitoring and what is the purpose. Ira may remember some discussions we had on the data monitoring committee for this trial that we were getting reports about how many people in each group experienced an increase in their serum creatinine level, and I kept saying the fact that lithium can cause people's creatinine to go up is a thing. And I don't think there's an inference question here. I think that question is answered. What we would want to know, however, is whether somebody's getting lithium or placebo. If their creatinine goes up, the investigator should probably deal with that appropriately. There probably is something about, whatever needs to be done to evaluate that, to follow up on that. So once again, that idea about, collecting those events because we're going to report them in some inferential activity versus saying this is what is, well, I don't know how to say it, good clinical practice without the air quotes around it. Meaning practice that actually is good and clinical, as opposed to what we sometimes, the good clinical practice with a capital G, capital C, capital P, which I sometimes say is neither good nor clinical.
There is a mirror image issue, though, about the common nuisance side effects. And the question is whether one can do a double-blind study about a medication like lithium. We think so in a real-world patient population where most people are on multiple medications. It may be impossible in otherwise healthy people, but that's an issue that'll be resolved over time.
So let's talk about blinding. To me, this would be a really important question for us to discuss further in terms of, when, if ever, is blinding necessary in a trial like this. So I want to put out there sort of a provocative position that, blinding of outcome assessment is foundational, absolutely essential. And anything, which introduces bias into outcome assessment is poisonous, I think, to the trial results. Blinding of analysis is probably very important, and we don't do very, very good job of that. What I'd like to know is that was everything in the trial analyzed with the labels on the groups hidden before anybody decided what it meant? Why do you blind patients and providers? I think, in this particular case, I would argue that blinding of patients and providers is completely unnecessary, and actually introduces distortion, which is problematic. I was, telling Adrian, that I would go ahead and say this. When I talk about the Rocket AF and the other NOACs trials, the jargon term we use is double dummy. And dummy, I think, may be the appropriate term for that practice. Because what we do is we fundamentally distort the nature of the treatment. Sometimes when we're comparing two active treatments, we require them to look identical, and we require for the experience of providers and patients to be identical, which sometimes obscures the truth. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes when we come back around. But had I been around at the beginning of the trial, Ira, I would have said, "Why are you blinding people?" So having taken that provocative position, I don't know if you'd go along with that and say, in retrospect, I wouldn't have bothered, or you think there's a value served in that?
What I wish we had done is something like a partially randomized patient preference design, in which I would have asked those who declined participation in a blinded study to choose one treatment or the other, looked at the outcomes, and then looked for interactions between randomization and outcome.
Yeah. So I think we dig into that a little more and think about, what does blinding do? Well, blinding takes away expectancy effects. If there are expectancy effects, if people have a belief that this treatment, the new treatment or the experimental treatment, is better or not better or worse, that expectancy effect, we would take that away. The question that I want to put out there is, when is that expectancy effect noise? And by that I mean something we need to control away. When is it signal? When is a belief about a treatment? So if we were to have two different treatments, we'll probably get to this in a few minutes, one of which requires frequent laboratory monitoring and another of which does not, that's not an expectancy effect. I think that's signal. That's a true inherent and enduring difference between those treatments that I would say, why would we want to make that go away? If we're studying treatments that have very different dosing schedules, why would we constrain the dosing schedules to be the same? Because the dosing schedules might have some important bearing on the acceptability and ultimately the adherence to those treatments. So I want to throw that out there, as we move into trials that are attempting to assess the real world impact of treatments, meaning if this treatment were actually being used by real world doctors and real world patients, how would its effectiveness compare to alternatives? How would its safety compare to the alternatives? Would blinding of treating clinicians and blinding of the patients or trial participants, what's the use? Any takers on that?
Actually, we should make sure to ask Bob Temple that question when he gets here, because I know he's a fan of blinding. But one other thing that to mention about at least where we've seen blinding actually become important is for people to actually stay in the protocol. So for a study, if they have uncertainty about whether they're getting active treatment or not, they will continue to follow up. It's not perfect, but again, that's one of the things that does come up. Or, you mentioned this in terms of expectedness of events, and it comes up more on, say, the safety side. Well, if someone knows what their treatment assignment is or suspects it, then they may be more sensitive to reporting, say, different feelings or different adverse events. So I think there are some things, but it's in terms of the holistic thing that you're talking about. To me, the RELY trial was a good example of that. It's not double dummy, and they still had rigorous evidence around what the treatment and the benefits and risk. So.
Yeah. So and I was taking that extreme position, because I wouldn't really take that extreme position, but I think to recognize that that blinding distorts and constrains, and we have to say, is it worth it? And how do we minimize those constraints and distortions that blinding introduces? Because I think it does.
Just one thing about the safety side. Rob mentioned, how much time we spend on, say, collecting non-serious adverse events, but it's also how much we collect around serious adverse events. And so, the life cycle medical product, as you have more precision on what's important, do you necessarily need to collect all the information that says, is it related or not, for instance, to the medical product? And so when we're talking about real-world evidence, that construct doesn't exist in terms of doctors do not go and put in an EMR in a tabulated way, as it related or not, possibly or not, as we do in a traditional evaluation of pharmacovigilance. And so there is something that has to kind of come together regarding that.
Yeah.
That one always drives me crazy too. When people say, "Was this adverse event related to the assignment between two treatments?" And I'd say, "I thought that's why we were doing a randomized trial." Sorry, I had to say that.
Okay. Well, let's go to the mic, and then we'll come back to Gracie. Please introduce yourself before you
it's Bill Potter at the National Institute of Mental Health, but also from the Alzheimer's field. So, Greg, to your point, in the safety discussion, and I think we struggle with this. So there's a class of drug called BACE inhibitors. In theory, if you really wanted to test the amyloid hypothesis, you'd actually be wanting to run your studies in people who don't have amyloid in their brain. But we have no idea what the long-term safety issue of BACE inhibitors were. So we could, in theory, give people the drugs, let them know they're on it, and measure their brain amyloid and argue, well, we don't think that your expectation bias is going to affect your rate of amyloid deposition. We could test that. On the other hand, to get to the safety issue, how would we manage that? In other words, Bob Temple's not here, but how much data would we need, blinded data around safety, would we feel the need to go forward with that strategy. And I think that's what's unclear. So what happened, just so everybody be aware of this, the BACE inhibitors have not been allowed to be used early because everybody's so worried about the long-term safety issues. So the right study that might have been done in a population in South Africa with high risk, genetically risk, is being used a drug that may not do anything at all because nobody was brave enough to use the BACE inhibitor because we didn't have enough safety data. So, but in these preventive studies with novel treatments, which you brought up, that's going to be the big issue. Okay, I would love to be able, but we couldn't do the study.
Any thoughts on this?
Yeah. No, but I think that's a case, as you say, where the inference question is paramount. Because we don't have strong enough priors. But I think your question about could this trial budge my priors on safety is always an important question to ask, because if no conceivable finding from this trial could budge my priors, then I'd say you probably can't do any inference at all.
So sort of to follow up a little bit on this one, if we could maybe ask ourselves, and maybe not exactly these trials, but just thinking, like, what would we need to define a risk benefit for when you're moving to any new indication? What is the minimum? And what would we want to know before doing this study? Because there could be situations that you can say a very wide use already helps us define, because the mechanism of toxicity when it translates to other diseases should be similar because of the comorbidities and the drugs. And it could be situations that you say, well, the safety profile could be different. Could we sort of define it ahead of time of what we need, and then pre-specify a little bit the monitoring better?
So I'm writing down in terms of generalizable rules, your point being that toxicity is less likely to be indication specific, that toxicity data may be more likely to transfer across indications while effectiveness data not.
Kathy Critchlow from Amgen. I find this use case just completely fascinating because of all of the issues, and one of which is suicidality would kill any trial where that's a off-target effect, but here when it's an outcome and safety. But in the blinding sense, what are your thoughts in terms of how does that affect, and you were getting at this, your feeling of equipoise for the trial? So as you're accumulating more information and you are maybe attributing things to one drug or another, they may or may not be real depending on how patients are, how the physician's treating them or how the patient's responding. But do you think there's a chance that the perception about equipoise might alter or evolve over the course of the study?
So if I understand your question, you're saying that a purpose of blinding here might be that beliefs or expectancies about the treatment would influence the reporting or ascertainment of the outcome. And that would be a very big problem. So I think, when you say, why would we blind? If blinding distorts the treatment, that's a negative effect. But if, depending on the nature of the outcome and how the outcome is ascertained, if we think blinding is necessary to maintain sort of unbiased, ascertainment of the outcome, then we gotta, I think.
Yeah, there's another specific issue here. The question is, if there is a lithium effect, is it a direct anti-suicide effect? Or is the putative lithium anti-suicide effect mediated by better control of the symptoms of depression or bipolar disorder? So whether or not the provider knows if the patient is on lithium may well affect their adjustment of treatment depending on symptoms during the course of the illness.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to pause for a moment and check in with Michael. Michael, if you're still on the phone, do you have any reflections or comments on what the discussion thus far?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think one of the aphorisms of of the real world is real world data is messy, and patients don't behave like classical clinical trials. And I think, I love the lithium example because, in fact, it was critical. But I also believe that that in the next phase, of whether you were talking about drugs for depression or whether some other examples, I think we all in the back of our minds have them. You really want to know as indications for new medications go on, as indications as new medications or even new treatment options are developed. We really do want to know how it behaves in patients with multi-comorbidities. Again, I hate to keep bringing up HIV examples, but obviously that's the area that I know best. But we now have a whole lot of drugs that work for antiretroviral naive patients who are 21 and this is their only medical problem. And they all work very well. Sorry to any specific drug company who has their own specific favorite product, but they all seem to work really well. But let's now make this a 55-year-old who comes in with hypertension and diabetes, and maybe even was diagnosed because of advanced HIV disease. Then these questions become far more complex. And additionally, this is what physicians in HIV really want to know. What do we do for these patients? What are the idealized treatments for these patients? These are not patients that would have been in a classic randomized clinical trial for very, very good reasons. And yet these are the patients who we now have to really talk about comparative treatments, comparative real-world data, and what is the collective safety knowledge? What is the collective efficacy knowledge? So I think that, that to say that I think we need to start exploiting these vagaries of the data. And as Greg pointed out very early on, what is effectively noise, and what in fact is effectively the questions you need to answer. And in fact, controlling for all of this actually dilutes what knowledge is to be gained.
Actually, I wanted to circle back around, based on what Michael said, to something Ira talked about that maybe you could tell us a bit more about. The issue about including people who were taking diuretics or ACE inhibitors in the trial, because it's a lithium specific example, but I think it really illustrates a general point that not just in the Department of Veterans Affairs, but everywhere, if we asked, who are the people who are at risk of dying by suicide, they are middle-aged and older men with chronic medical problems, who are people who, most of them are taking diuretics and ACE inhibitors. Now, that was a very important and I think consequential decision to say we're going to in some ways push the safety margin, because there were concerns about, is this treatment safe, but those are the people who need it. So how did you negotiate that?
It's interesting. We argued that standard clinical practice can be to treat precisely these patients with lithium for their bipolar disorder, in spite of the increased risks and need for extra monitoring. The IRB said back, but there you have a benefit versus a risk, and in a study like this, one can't have a therapeutic misconception. One has to assume no risk, no benefit rather, and therefore no incremental risk is permissible. We then came back a year later and said, you're right, but we have to ensure that the subjects are representative of the real people at real risk, and unless this is changed, recruitment just isn't feasible.
Yeah, I think this is sort of touches upon the second question of interest about when can these naturally occurring variability in the variables that we're seeking to measure, when is that considered noise, and when is that considered a valid signal that has to be studied? So are there any generalizable guidance about noise versus valid questions? It depends on the context. I realize it's context dependent, but what are some of the contexts that can help us make that decision?
Well, it might be helpful to hear from Ira and maybe from Michael, both in the lithium for suicide prevention example and then possibly also in the pre-exposure prophylaxis example about, how much you need to sort of, control and augment the care people are getting in the comparison group. And to a level where you will prevent the outcome from ever occurring and then guarantee a null result. So to what extent would you say, I'm sure this must have come up in this trial, to say, well, you're enrolling people who have, you're enrolling people who've attempted suicide, and as you say, have a 15% risk of reattempt over the next year, and you're allowing the people who are getting placebo to continue in their usual care. Don't you need to be tracking those people down and keeping them engaged in care and doing all sorts of things to make sure they get optimal care, and if there's ever any hint, to put them in the hospital, and so on and so on? And then to what degree, when you start to do that, do you then move out of the real world into treatment that bears no relation to the world that these treatments would ever be used? I'm sure you must have had to struggle with that a lot.
We were actually largely able to do this study because VA has a significant infrastructure and policy environment related to suicide prevention. There are requirements for nationally visible high-risk flags for patients at risk for suicide, for facilitated access to follow-up care, for frequencies of additional face-to-face encounters with providers, so that the baseline, the enhanced usual care, is really far above community standards for this.
Yeah, and I think when we come back around to sort of generalizable principles, that idea that our usual care certainly should be at least as good as typical or as general standards. It certainly would probably not be ethical to say, let's go search for a place where usual care is so terrible so that we'll magnify the difference between our treatment and usual care. That wouldn't be right, and also not generalizable either. But that needs to be at least as good as, we have to acknowledge, will usually introduce something of a conservative bias, I think, to say, if the usual care in this trial is a bit better than the usual care, that will typically blunt the difference. Michael, I'm curious if you have how that relates to the pre-exposure prophylaxis example, because you talked about in those trials everyone getting sort of probably a little bit more than usual care in terms of what advice they're getting about their sexual behaviors.
Yeah. So first off, let me just give the disclosure that I was not an investigator or co-investigator on those trials, but I know most of those people well. They at every visit they got a goodly supply of condoms. They were all given very formal instruction about safer sex. But we knew, as I said, the pregnancies, there were also X number of other sexually transmitted diseases being co-occurring at the time in follow-up visits. So we knew that, as has been shown very well in much earlier prevention, HIV prevention efforts, the use of condoms and safer sex did not have 100% fidelity. I think that, again, I think that is sometimes, it can actually be used in favor as you study these diseases and treatment options.
Okay, very good. Before we sort of have a repeat discussion with regards to the novel oral anticoagulants in comparison with warfarin, I wonder if anybody from the audience have any final comments or questions. Okay, well, maybe I'd like actually to digress a little bit and try to tie this discussion and this presentation to the first workshop about real-world data and real-world evidence. I was actually quite intrigued, or maybe not surprised, by the comment that observational studies were not equivocal when it comes to studying this question of lithium and suicide prevention. So was there, I think it'd be curious at least to think about, was there any efforts made to try to understand why these observational studies produced inconsistent results? What were some of the limitations, whether does it have to do with some of the issues we discussed in the morning about data quality or the endpoints or adequacy of the data? So I think tying these two would be important as we sort of synthesize this.
By and large, the observational studies were consistent, and meta-analysis after meta-analysis has really suggested effectiveness, actually. Yeah.
And I did one of those studies when I still had hair. That's how long ago it was. And, found a fairly robust difference between lithium and anticonvulsant type mood stabilizers in terms of risk of suicide using a sort of both between person and within person comparison. But as Ira said, I think the confounding by indication problem is just too large there, given the data we had at the time. Now that we have better data, we might be able to do a better job.
And that's really my next comment. If we have better now characterization of this confounding by indication, would conducting a retrospective study of some sort enable us to actually be more confident in the findings of these studies?
So I think what our plan was to sort of reintroduce that warfarin versus NOACs and then use that as a sort of springboard to talk. And I had some slides, but I think they're not necessary.
Yeah, well, I'll defer to you, but exactly. So that's really a nice transition into the remaining segment of this workshop. And to sort of continue the discussion, because that greatly involves a number of also retrospective studies. So I think, Greg.
Yeah. So Adrian.
Please go ahead. Did you want to use the slides? Or?
No, we don't need to, I think, because Adrian did a really nice job this morning presenting sort of the chain of evidence in terms of what the randomized trials have shown, the variation among them, how that relates to the subsequent observational evidence. But what I'd like to do is to sort of, if I can get you to recollect that use case, but to take it into this session to think about two really particular examples, very relevant to the questions we were just discussing. One of those is related to the sort of, how much the randomized trials of NOACs versus warfarin constrained the treatments to be similar versus did not. So I think, for instance, and I'm looking at Adrian to make sure I've got this right, but the RELY trial, for instance, was not blinded. It was an open label trial where warfarin was provided as warfarin would be, and the new comparator was provided as it would be, while the Rocket AF trial was your classic sort of double dummy design, where we required both the treatments to be the same. People were blinded. People who were getting the NOACs they had to get their INRs monitored, even though that was not relevant to the treatment. They got dummy pills, so everything looked identical. And the question is, and Adrian, a little side comment, when I was joking with Adrian about the concepts of double dummy, and I said maybe double dummy means it's dumb. Adrian said, no, it just means it's double the cost. So there certainly is a price to be paid by all of that, and the question is, does it distort the question? The other thing, going back when Adrian talks about sort of time in therapeutic window, And that gets back to this question about real-world treatment and how much we must corral real-world treatment and get real-world treatment to follow the rules and behave as we would like it to. Is the optimal comparison for warfarin versus NOACs a trial where, and this could not happen except in some imaginary universe, a trial where everyone taking warfarin is in range 100% of the time? Is that the right comparison? Is the right comparison sort of people's time in INR range is equal to what we observe in the randomly selected person taking warfarin in the United States of America, the average quality in the US, the average percent of time in range in the world of people taking warfarin? Are we trying to replicate the quality, consistency, and even safety of the treatment as it's provided? Or are we saying, and I think this is where a lot of the NOACs trials came down, sort of the same way the lithium trial came down, we can't be perfect, but we're going to try to do a little better than the real world does, knowing that that may blunt the difference between treatments, but we feel like that's sort of an ethical obligation. So I know Bob's got thoughts about this, so I'm going to let him talk.
You're actually interested in both. You want to know, and the trials tried to get this, how optimal warfarin treatment compares with these others. Pretty optimal. It wasn't perfect by any means.
Good as we can do warfarin treatment.
Right, and the results were pretty striking for the thing that the drugs prevent, that is thromboembolic stroke. The results were identical on 2 out of the 4 drugs. I mean, we don't have the edoxaban data out. That maybe looked a little better. The only one that was better on that endpoint was Dabi. Only one. The other 2 were absolutely identical. Now, we mistakenly, I'm unhappy about this in retrospect, counted all strokes as the primary endpoint. So the fact that the new drugs produced fewer hemorrhagic strokes made them look like they won. But they won entirely because of that. And otherwise, they were pretty even. Now, in the real world, where you don't think the INR is as well done, there might be an advantage to these new ones. And you're interested in that, too. I don't think you could do a trial where you deliberately gave people inadequate warfarin. That'd be a little dicey. No, and you could, and the studies that are being done now are tending to show that the new ones are a little better on thromboembolic stroke. And maybe that's because control of warfarin is not as good in those environments. What people don't recognize enough is that the one finding that emerges 100% of the time, all the time, is hemorrhagic stroke, which is a bad deal. And all 4 of the drugs look clearly better. Whether one of them is better than another on that, we don't know yet because there are no direct comparisons.
But I think your point about certainly you would not say let's intentionally deliver bad warfarin treatment as our comparison group, but you could intentionally find bad warfarin treatment by choosing your trial setting.
Well, and believe me, there were many analyses of how good control of what the effect size was in people who were very well controlled, not so well controlled, and so on. And there's at least some tendency for warfarin to do better when the control is better, but it's not as precise as you might have liked.
Adrian is going to.
So this issue about having comparisons to, or either on to perfect care or on top of perfect care is a real challenge. So as in certain areas where there are multiple treatments that are coming on board or currently available, the question has always come up as like, well, how does treatment A, in addition to so-called standard of care, and standard of care varies greatly within the U.S., around the world, partly because of clinical practice, partly because of access, other issues. And so that always becomes a challenge in terms of understanding whether, say, a new therapy is better than standard of care or better to X on top of a usual care. And so I think that's one of the things to Bob's comment, like we want to understand both kind of questions, like in the efficacy in terms of whether there's a benefit to risk, but also relative to also what's unusual practice, because that can be very informative, especially if someone has a better tolerability profile for a medical product, et cetera.
One other use case we talked about using in this session, which is one of great interest to me, is long-acting injectable antipsychotic medication versus oral medication in prevention of relapse in people with severe mental illness, which is a very important public health question. And as many of you know, long-acting injectable medications are hardly used at all in this country and used much more commonly in Europe.
But we just put a claim for one in the label, and it keeps you out of prison.
Oh yeah, no, and I'm down with that. But you know, once again, that's a use case of a very interesting question to say, if we're comparing a long-acting injectable to oral medication under what circumstances and provided how? Because certainly, you know, in the optimal environment, we would say oral medication would be delivered with adequate psychosocial support, with close monitoring of adherence, and likely with a fairly good, high-quality intensive case management program for people who've been hospitalized for an exacerbation of psychotic disorder. But that ain't the world we live in.
Well, you already know if compliance were just as good on the oral, there wouldn't be a difference between the drugs. You already know that.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there could be, but that is the point.
World, but
yeah. So the question,
they didn't force the oral down the throat every day, for example.
I mean, is that the only advantage of a long-acting injectable? Is just simply adherence, or is there other factors that potentially be there?
Effect?
That probably is what it is. I mean, the blood levels are in the same territory, and they both work, and you'd expect them to. But compliance seems the most likely.
Yeah, I think we'd all say that. The difference is there might be 10% of the difference that's other things. We would only disagree about whether it's 90% or 100% that's due to the adherence differences. But so there, once again, the question: if you're doing that study, in what setting? Do you pick your setting to say, we're going to go for really bad care so the long-acting injectables look spectacular, or we're going to go for pretty good care, or we're going to go for unrealistically good care?
Well, in some sense, you'd like to pre-specify what you're looking at, and the results could be different in different groups. I mean, the oral group could be taking pills that have a little message on them that tells the doctor whether they're taking them or not. You can do that now.
That's the thing.
We have the drug. No, you want to know all those things. And real world, in this case, matters a lot. It means you get to a mental hospital or go to jail or something if you don't take it. And poor compliance is the explanation for, half the bad health in the country. I mean, people have looked. If you look at people on antihypertensives, half of them aren't taking them anymore by the end of the year. Or maybe Cleveland Clinic's done a little better than that, but still, it's a third. A large part of our misery is due to not taking the drugs that work.
You're making the case that the difference is moderated by patient variables and provider variables.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, in this case, the whole question is whether the whole study turns on whether they took the drug or not. Because we don't think if they took them all, there'd be any difference. That I don't know. That could be proven, but. That's the idea. It was to improve the ability to have people stay on the drug for the whole month.
Yeah. So the long-acting injectables might be the sort of extreme use case of, we believe it's all people's misbehavior that accounts for the difference, while the warfarin versus NOACs is one where the poor quality of care might be an important moderator of the effect that we observe, but it's not the whole difference. There is likely a true difference between the biological action of these drugs.
Now, the newer studies aren't as good as the original study is distinguishing one kind of stroke from the other. So I'm not sure they always can tell whether it's a thromboembolic stroke or hemorrhagic stroke, and that could make a difference. But some of those trials are making the new drugs look a little better on stroke prevention, which in the controlled trials, they really didn't on thromboembolic stroke. Dabby a little, but mostly not. They were about even. But that's because taking warfarin was pretty well done.
I want to know if we can get back to this blinding question, because I know when we talked about that earlier, before you came, and I should have waited till you got here, to be provocative, took the sort of extreme position that, blinding of outcome assessment, absolutely foundational. Blinding of data analysis probably should be foundational, although it's often not. Blinding of patients and providers, not so much.
Well, it depends a little on what you're worried about. If you believe that knowing what therapy the person's on affects your interpretation of whether there was an adverse effect or not, or affects your encouragement of the person to take it, then you'd worry about those things, or what other drugs you add to it. To the extent it alters behavior, you should worry.
Yeah. And alters behavior, and because to me, there's our goal for this meeting is to get to some principles, to get to some rules that we could ask people to follow. So, blinding definitely alters behavior to the extent that it alters the behavior about the way doctors and patients use treatments. It may not be a good thing because it takes us away from the real world, but it may be a necessary evil. But
suppose knowing they're on the new drug because you're a believer in the new drug makes you push their use more than the control drug.
Yeah.
Well, you wouldn't think that's a good thing.
So blinding is about outcomes.
Well, there's that too, but this is what I just said is not about outcomes. It's about assuring compliance, assuring that they're getting all the measurements they're supposed to, and even the decision about whether to add another drug. I mean, in some studies, if people don't respond, you increase standard of care, do that stuff. Could that be affected? I don't know the answer to that. It's very hard to know. But those are the things you worry.
Yeah, so no, these are hard to know. I mean, for instance, the one that comes up in the long-acting injectables versus oral medication is, if someone shows up in the emergency department, appearing to experience an exacerbation of psychotic symptoms, and I know that they're taking long-acting injectables, I know they've already got medication on board. And if somebody shows up in an emergency department with an exacerbation of psychotic symptoms and they're taking oral medication, my first suspicion is they got no medication on board. Yeah. So my clinical management might well vary. So that's an example where the blinding actually could introduce a distortion. I think, as I say, I took the extreme position just to provoke the discussion, but I think what we're trying to do is to march through the when and how could it matter, because sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't.
People are inclined to think that if the endpoint isn't subjective, it's no big deal. Okay, so for a mortality study, well, we know whether they're alive or dead. Why are you blinding? And the endpoint and the interpretation of the endpoint or side effects, those are both perfectly legitimate issues. But what I worry more about is whether you modify your therapy differently depending on whether you know what the person is on. And that could be a worry.
So that, I guess the question then, let's pursue that a little. So the question about the modifying the therapy, the question is that a generalizable phenomenon that would hold true in the future, or is that an artifact that we would want to take away? So if there is how I might respond, let's go back to warfarin NOACs, for instance, how I might respond to a bleeding event obviously would be different if I thought someone was taking warfarin or taking NOACs. But I don't think that's distortion. I think that's truth. I think the interventions we have available to reverse anticoagulation are different for those two treatments, and that's a fundamental characteristic of the treatments that we wouldn't want to. Do you understand?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure in that case what I would be most worried about. It might influence whether you give them aspirin in addition or other drugs that might interact and things like that. I'm not sure how critical it is to blind those. The endpoints are pretty objective, and somebody else is looking at the INR, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. Someone else should manage it. Blinding is, there are plenty of trials that have been unblinded, that have not been double-blind. Well, so I think it's something to worry about, but I don't think we have a rule.
So just was wondering if Bob or Greg to comment about the trade-off. So because I think what you're talking about is that blinding helps in terms of ensuring consistent behavior, whether it's the participant or the clinician. But it does add all these things where the population may be more homogeneous, because if they have to get on blinded treatment, then they have to go through all sorts of rigmarole to always come into the site to get their treatment and so forth. Is there, this is a multidimensional equation we're talking about. What's the trade-off to have a broader, more heterogeneous population where the effects of or benefits of risk across different groups, or more homogeneous population that is going to be very tightly controlled?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion of that going on. We're pushing to not exclude people needlessly and things like that. But I'm an advocate of enrichment designs. Well, that's not the general population. You're picking people who are very likely to have have the bad outcome of interest, or you might even be picking people who you think are going to respond. I think understanding what drives the result is crucial. So, and you also want to know whether the drug works. So I think to have early trials be enriched with people who are going to have a lot of events, so you'll be able to show something if it's there, is very sensible. A good question is whether it applies to lower risk people. So a lot of cardiovascular outcome trials pick people who've had a prior MI. And that's because they're much more likely to have another one later than people who don't. So if you get your conclusion, then that's called secondary prevention. And we have not been perfectly consistent in whether, having established secondary prevention, we also give you primary prevention. And there are outcomes that are a little distressing. Aspirin trials in people for primary prevention have really not been very successful, except for the one that I was in, the Physician's Health Study. That was very successful, 50% reduction in MIs. But most of the other trials don't show much, whereas secondary prevention, they do. Well, what should you do there? And the public guidances on when to use aspirin are all over the map too, because they don't know what to do either. So I like enrichment, even if it's not the general population, because it helps you win and you find out whether the drug works or not. The right thing to then do is then look at a lower risk population. And certainly that's what people have done with statins. All the initial trials were secondary prevention, and then they went and did a primary prevention trial, and those worked too. And then the Jupiter study went further, and they picked people who had an evidence of inflammation, and they showed that. Do I know whether people with an LDL of below 130 who don't have evidence of inflammation should get the drug? No, I don't, but I know more than I would have. Yeah. So, I mean, those are very thorny questions. Also, to get the lower risk population, to get a result in them, you may have to randomize 25,000 people, and you can't do it.
Okay, so after Rob, we'll go to Sebastian.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first, since I'm always trying to develop my own interpretation of what Bob Temple is saying. And
sorry, I make that necessary.
my interpretation of the history that leads to his thinking, and he can either reject or accept this, obviously. The point that he's always made to me is that it's so hard to show that your drug works at all. Enrichment is a good idea early on. And, I got a real lesson in this last week. I was on a panel with Sanjay Gupta, who's a pretty smart guy and has been around the world. He almost fell out of his chair when I told him that almost 90% of drugs that get into phase 1 don't make it to market. He just was completely unaware of that, which, by the way, has major implications for right to try, which I'm resisting talking about. I'll get the bell. I'm gonna ring the bell. I know I'll get the bell. But the reason I'm optimistic in the intermediate term now, so I accept the Temple thing that you need to show your drug works in some environment for some period of time early on, because just opening it wide open, unless you're really lucky, is just too risky to get the basic signal. But the presumption then should be that something else is done to fill in the gaps. And there are several variations of this that I think are going to carry the day. One is what you mentioned, that in lower risk populations, if you have the same level of toxicity, the benefit risk balance can be quite different. But the other, which we heard very loudly yesterday from the payers and the government in Europe, is that if we don't fill in that gap with relatively real-world evidence about the cost when used as it will be used in the real world relative to the benefits, it's going to be pretty hard for people to pay what the cost is. So this is going to drive, I think, many more of these. But am I right about the basic history and why? By the way, he also had no idea you had personally pulled 3,000 drugs off the market or whatever that number was.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, getting evidence in a lower risk population is going to be hard in any environment. It's hard to do the trial because, you need 10 times as many people. But it's going to be hard to do it with real world data too, because the effect size, even if it's the same as it is in the larger one, is going to result in many, many, many fewer events. It's not an easy thing to fix.
It's not easy, but that's the point. I don't think that intelligent people are much longer going to tolerate. We studied it in this rarefied population, and it worked. That's a good thing. And now let's give it to millions of people for their whole lives and pray.
But the answer to that is to enable trials in large numbers of people that are not as costly or difficult.
Which means we have to stop doing all the stuff we were just talking about and focus on the things that matter.
Yeah. One thing to note, though, that this strategy of enrichment, in a sense, is part of the aspiration of personalized medicine, where you're trying to discover the subpopulation where the benefit-risk profile is optimized. Now, our paradigm may have to shift completely to ensure that we develop medicines for the broad population that answers to all the stakeholders and that are reimbursable. But I think the essence really is the aspiration of personalized medicine.
It is personalized, but you don't get great data on the non-selected population. So you have good data on the population you did study, but you don't have anything on the others. But I think the answer is to figure out how to do trials with 50,000 people in them that are not costly and are done using real-world environments and everybody agrees to be randomized. They're not impossible. The European ISIS trials had some elements of that.
Okay, we can. Sebastian.
Can I make a comment?
Sorry, Sebastian, and then Michael. So thank you.
Thank you.
So just a quick comment. Sebastian Schneebers from Boston. So the two examples are really interesting, long-acting APMs and the DOACs, right? Because in both settings, the clinical strategy, let it play out, as the clinical strategy, right, works in your favor of the long-acting or of the DOACs compared to warfarin or the orals. And while if you study the molecule in a very narrow sense, right, you might be penalized there. So the generalizable question is arising for that. To what extent does the regulator have the discretion to go down the road of regulating clinical strategies versus the molecules very narrowly, right? And what are the deciding factors where, because you always have to make that choice, right? How much do you want to enforce that patients are in therapeutic range in these DOAC studies, right? You have a choice there. And how do you make that choice as a regulator?
I just have to. So what you're saying is to put a fine point on that. You're saying, would we ever approve a long-acting injectable with the indication this is effective in a bad healthcare system?
Well, you'd have to go look at a lot of cases. I don't believe we're perfectly consistent. The current indication for blood pressure drugs gives all of them credit for lowering the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death. It doesn't link it to how deviant you are. That's because we believe that trials over the years have shown that for every level of elevation, probably down to even 130 or thereabouts, you get a benefit, goes in the right direction, and affects all three of those things. The absolute value of the effect is way bigger if you're more abnormal, if you start out at 200, but there continues to be an effect at lower levels, and fortunately in hypertension, we have trials of enormous size at all levels. I don't think people feel as secure about that in some other areas, and then they're worried about whether the toxicity now overwhelms it. And I don't know how to make a perfectly consistent thing, but we haven't been perfectly consistent. We've sometimes given broad indications, even when the trial was mostly done in heart failure trials are uniformly enriched to find people who are likely to do badly. And they're all add-on trials, so the size of the effect is modest. Nobody's on placebo. 100% of them add the new therapy to the standard of care. Usually in people who are thought to be at high risk. They then just get a claim for add-on therapy in people who haven't responded to the previous one. Doesn't say they have to be high risk. We don't take that into account.
The REMS programs, though, give approval conditional about monitoring, which
Sometimes.
is similar to clozapine, for example.
Well, but all you're monitoring, you're not monitoring effect. All you're monitoring is agran.
Yeah. So the hypothesis is
REMS
that
is entirely devoted. This is my regret. I'd like us to be able to have REMS to ask for outcome data, but we don't have that yet.
So let me get to Michael then.
Yeah.
But it's to monitor for safety concerns.
Yeah. Okay, Michael, and then we have after that we'll go there. Michael, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So, it's interesting. And one of the reasons why I really liked the DOAC versus warfarin study, this is essentially, I think, somewhere where Greg was going is, are you talking about the standard of care? Are you talking about best practice or what is usual practice, especially when it comes to warfarin? And, it depending on, and this is why real-world experience is so important, and why you're going to have to start looking at the healthcare setting. If you have dedicated clinical pharmacists who have real patient engagement and are actively monitoring the warfarin, the INRs, you're probably not going to see as much differential, except then you get into the issue of efficacy versus effectiveness. And in fact, you are now putting in a lot of extra costs and extra efforts to the system that may, in fact, be alleviated by the newer agents, even if your outcomes are not all that different from each other. So you're going to start looking at it from a more global perspective.
I don't think anybody doubts that improved simplicity of care can have advantages because people take the drugs and stay on them. I mean, my view has long been that the major imperfection in our healthcare system is that people don't stay on the drugs they should. Most people with atrial fibrillation are not on a NOAC or anything else. Half of them anyway, has been shown they're not getting their blood pressure controlled. They're not on the best drugs for heart failure. They're probably not all on statins like they should be. And getting people to comply better is probably the most important thing the healthcare system could do, and we don't do that very often.
Okay, I think we have a...
And I like that you put that on the healthcare system, not on the patient.
We should learn how to do it.
Question or comment from the...
Yeah, this is Jonathan Watanabe, one of the National Academy of Medicine Fellows. And so the question is, I guess, for the panel. So if we've got and I think I could relate this to the warfarin issue, is if we're going through these efforts to reduce bias by blinding the rater and blinding the analyst, then isn't it worth it to blind the prescriber just because we've gone so far to reduce bias to make sure that we can't attribute, particularly if it's a marginal benefit. So if we have a marginal benefit and then we know that, well, it likely isn't the analyst and it's likely it's not the rater, then there still is that tinge that it could have been the prescriber knowing. And I think particularly for the warfarin issue, for everything that's just been described, it's that, you may, theoretically, if you are a prescriber, you may want the NOAC or the DOAC to win out because that is more labor intensive for you as a prescriber. So, I mean, is that a situation where if we're going through these efforts to reduce bias, that completing the circle would be blinding the prescriber?
I think, as I said, I took that position to sort of be provocative, but I think that, the blinding usually doesn't make bias, and it often protects against, but the concern is that blinding certainly adds cost, and often I think reduces generalizability. Now,
let's
Yeah.
be clear. In a big trial like anticoagulants, I would say $200 million.
Yeah, so serious money.
$200 million.
Yeah, serious money.
That's the cost.
That's real money.
That's the cost of.
You know what?
Yeah, because you have to have a dummy. You have to have a dummy where you're running. And so it just totally changes the entire. I mean, we did this in 2 big trials, and, it turned out they worked. It was maybe worth it. Their drugs are doing pretty well, but, man, that's a lot of money, and you got to.
Yeah. One other use case I'd like to sort of circle back around to that we didn't bring up, but, based on what you just said, is the extreme, going even farther, is what I call the randomized nudge trial, and that's the impact AFib trial. Some of you, may be well aware of that. Which is that's going the ultimate example to say, we're not attempting to control this treatment at all. We're just sending a nudge to patients and to their providers saying, hey, there's a treatment that works and you're not getting it. And then
that's a push toward the underuse thing that I was describing.
Yeah.
I mean, something like half of all people are there for not on anything.
Yeah, but can we use the nudge to the underusers for valid inference about treatment effects? So my question, I guess, would be back to the lithium example, Ira, because one of the challenges you had is in this really high-risk situation where we have a treatment that we believe might work. This was a heroic study, I think, that that lithium trial. It would have been interesting to do a randomized nudge trial, to say, let's take the entire, Veterans Affairs healthcare system, and let's say we're going to contact everybody who has a high risk for suicide attempt or has made a suicide attempt, and we're going to send a message to them and their providers saying, lithium could help save your life. Maybe you should take it. And we might move the uptake rate of lithium from 4%, which is probably about where it is now in those people. Maybe we'd get it to 12% if we were really lucky, and we'd have to try to do inference on the 8% difference.
Well, you could also do secondary randomization, randomized to being pushed and not pushed.
Yeah, no, that's what we said. We'd randomize the nudge. We would we'd randomize the nudge, and in the control group we'd have the baseline 4% uptake, and in the nudge group we'd have the 12% uptake.
It'd be good to know. It would tell you what you should do.
It answers a policy question.
Yes, it does.
Now that would answer the policy question. Could you ever, let's say this isn't going to happen, but let's say somebody said, we'd like to get lithium, a new indication approved for lithium for suicide prevention, and we want to do that based on a randomized nudge study.
So can I?
Well, but you also have the outcome data.
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
So I think this is.
But look, I mean, we just approved the injectable antipsychotic for as showing that you keep people out of jail and mental institutions.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think this is really important because you were going back into clinical trials and we're starting in real world evidence. And one of the things that when I was at the FDA, where I started and took all Bob's classes in clinical trials, which were fantastic, we talked a lot about possibly talking about quasi-experimental, and we really don't do it. And maybe the time has come to think about this. You say nudge studies. The VA system is huge. You have an approved drug. You have an endpoint that's actually pretty difficult to measure, as the FDA has spent many years trying to come up with the best way to measure, you said, suicidality or suicide risk. There's a lot of research about prospective, retrospective measurements. So the question is, what about a quasi-experimental?
Yeah.
You can roll that out in some systems and not in others.
Yeah.
And look at that.
Yeah. No, you could. You could do a sort of stepped roll. But I want to be clear. When I say
a cluster randomized trial.
When I say a randomized nudge study, it is an experiment. It's not a quasi-experiment. It's an absolute experiment. We're talking about individual level randomization in a classic parallel group randomized design. But what's being randomized is the nudge. So. Oh no. That you couldn't get more real world than impact AFib.
And the randomized nudge or randomized encouragement design with medical record outcomes is probably the most efficient of all RCTs.
Yeah, we're doing that trial now, so we have 15,000 randomized in that trial because it's more of a randomized nudge trial. So, I think but back to your point of, we've got to figure out way more efficient ways to do randomization the randomized nudge is a remarkably more efficient way. We didn't present, we don't have time to talk about impact AFib, but many of you are familiar with it, which is, going log orders of magnitude better in terms of cost per participant.
So along those lines, do you think the nudge matters? So like an obvious nudge in healthcare are dollars. And so you could, thinking about whether it's extinguishing co-pays for a randomized group, that's an obvious thing, or actually nudges to doctors via reimbursement about in a random fashion about how they treat someone.
We should test all of those things. I don't know how to get people to comply better, but I just
money
named the
works.
things. I mean, lipid lowering and blood pressure and atrial fibrillation are lethal, and they're very undertreated. We know that. Anything that could get people to treat them more, whether it's a reward at the end or getting their name taken out of the list of incompetence or whatever. we don't know how to make people do the right thing. But it's also possible drugstores, CVS and places could introduce things like that. They could, when a patient is no longer doesn't renew, they could call the doctor and harass him. I mean, there's lots of possibilities, and they need to be explored because it's the major health problem.
Yep. Okay, very good. In the remaining few minutes, I think I'd like to digress again at the risk of ringing the bell, but we have a question from the webcast, actually. And the question is specifically asking about how does the observational studies versus the trials in the case of the NOACs, how did they differ or agree with one another? I think that's relevant also to the third session that we're having this afternoon.
Well, we see lots of them. David Graham's just done another one in another system, and they're pretty. It depends on what you believe the results of the other trials show. Remember, there are no direct comparisons except with warfarin. The one finding that shows up all the time, decreased hemorrhagic stroke, shows up in all of these things too. It doesn't. I don't even know if there's a difference, but it's very clear. Dabi had a 75% reduction in those events. The other two drugs were closer to 50%. Dabi was clearly not dose related because the high dose and low dose were essentially identical. The high dose actually had fewer. And the other drugs, they look a little bit like it might be dose related for that. So all of those things are not really fully answerable, but they're generally in the same direction. But I think some of the epi studies also tend to show a somewhat better reduction in thromboembolic strokes, which I have to say was mostly not seen in the control trials except for Dabi.
And
so, but I don't know if any of those differences are real. What we need is a large randomized trial of the NOACs.
Yeah.
We're working on it.
And the question, to me, one of the $64 questions hidden in that is that when we look at the observational studies versus the randomized trials, one big difference we have is randomization, but the other big difference we have is sort of how the treatments were delivered and who was delivering the treatments. So if we say the observational studies in general may appear to indicate a bigger advantage in terms of thromboembolic events than the randomized trials did. Is that because there's a confounding by indication problem that the randomized trial solved, or is that because when you let treatment happen in the real world, there is an advantage?
You don't know. It's plausible that INR is better done.
Yeah.
In the trials, they were very compulsive about it. There were demands made on them. It wouldn't surprise you if warfarin did a little less well in the real world.
Yeah,
but it's hard to know.
So maybe impact AFib will help with that because what it's doing is the randomized nudge. If we can draw valid inference from the randomized nudge, that should, I think, take care of the confounding by indication problem.
That's if part 2 works. I mean, part 1 is did they use drugs?
Right.
Part 2 is did it lead to fewer strokes?
Yeah, if we can get a signal.
That's the hard one.
If the randomized nudge design gets a signal, would we believe it is then a valid signal because it was randomized? And then would that be able to help us dissect the question of confounding by indication versus tight control of treatment?
But, I mean, in some cases, the benefits of better compliance are just perfectly obvious. If I know that at 1 year, half the people who are hypertensive are no longer on drug, I know they're going to suffer strokes because of that. I mean, you know that. Treatment benefits. And even improving compliance or figuring out how to do it, I think that would speak for itself in some of these areas where treatment is known to work.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question or comment. So anyone from our audience here?
Or Michael, any last
yeah, or Michael, any other last comments or thoughts?
No, you guys have stated it well. It's been great.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, so I think we will break for lunch. Then we will attempt to, the panel will attempt to synthesize some common themes, and we'll begin in the afternoon with a brief summary or synthesis, and then we'll move to the third and final workshop for the day. So thank you all very much for your time and for your thoughts.
I will leave my stuff. Thank you.